Welcome, welcome, come on in. The show's about to begin. Grab your seat and feel the nostalgia grow. Sit tight, relax, and enjoy the ride. We're so glad you're here. Let's go. It's time for Let's Play with AppleMatt.
This here is one of the shacks that our town's Mexican population lived in. By the way, the first cowboys were Mexican. They were called vaqueros, and that came from the Spanish word for cow. But it sounded like buckaroo to English speakers, so that name stuck. We inherited a whole mess of other Western lingo from the Mexican vaqueros, too, along with their gear. Their rawhide rope, la riata, became lariat, and them rawhide pants, chaparreras, came down to us as chaps. To find out more about the Mexicans' role in the Old West, amble on down to the cantina where they used to gather. And to find out more about how they live day to day, click around this building. These Mexican folks had the right idea using adobe, because it kept them insulated from Tombstone's blistering summers and bone-chilling winters. They'd mix adobe clay with straw and fashion bricks out of the mix. The floors were made of dirt mixed with sheep's blood, and the windows were usually real small, smaller than this one, often with just a slit in the wall with animal material stretched over it, enough to keep the air flowing. As for the roof, it was made of mud, and in good weather, the Mexicans would grow gardens on top. They'd have to climb a ladder to chase the chickens away. Oil lamps were everyone's lifeblood out west, where electricity was slow in making its way. In the dark Mexican homes, oil lanterns were especially important. It was light for Mexican seamstresses, also called costureras, who did fine work for not much money. The lamps also shone on the small home altars that were part of so many Mexican homes. In most cases, you'd also find a hearth, where the ladies would cook up spicy meals of chicken, beans, and corn flour tortillas, and pods of dried red peppers. I never could eat them graceful like, without a nose a-running and my eyes going all teary-eyed. Your Spanish mission churches set the architectural style for the whole Southwest. Adobe. Adobe construction was great for the desert because it didn't require Eastern-style building materials like timber. All you needed was earth and water. And them adobe buildings also withstood fires much better than wood buildings did. Plus, their thick walls gave you a kind of a natural air conditioning. They slowly absorbed the sun during the hot desert days, and then released the heat into your rooms during the cold nights. I believe the confessional booth is closed right now. Too bad for you, partner. But you can click around the outside of the church to find out more about the spiritual life in the Old West. Starting in the late 1500s, Spanish Catholic folk began building mission churches like this one all over the western United States. Most always made of adobe, missions had, and still have, a very distinctive style of architecture. Especially the bell tower. All kinds of goings-on were signaled by the mission bell. Everything from Sunday services to a wedding or to an Apache raid. Most folks in the Old West saw churches as a stabilizing influence in the community. No matter how wicked a town, if there was a church, people felt more at ease. At Tombstone's Peak, the town had no less than 4 churches. And did you know that some of those churches in the Old West were built by donations from gamblers? Guess that's what you call hedging your bets. Most people in the Old West were hard-drinking, woman-chasing, gambling kind of folk who never went in much for religion. Endicott Peabody, Tombstone's first minister, heard that it was the rottenest place you ever saw. But that didn't stop all kinds of Presbyterians, Methodists, Mormons, Baptists, and others from doing the Lord's work. Ministers who used to ride from town to town spreading the word of God met plenty of opposition. Folks sometimes called them gospel sharks or sky pilots. Photography was well established by the time the Earps rolled into Arizona in 1879. In fact, here we've recreated the studio of a renowned Western photographer. It stood right next door to the OK Corral in Tombstone. When the famous shootout with the Earps began, both Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne ran here to safety. Lucky for them that Mr. Fly didn't catch that on film. Actually, your purveyors of affordable photography, like Fly, were helping to make the world a more democratic place. In the older days, you would have had to be a wealthy traveler to get a glimpse of far-off lands, and only rich folk could afford to have their portraits painted. But now, thanks to cheap pictures, anyone could see the world after a fashion, and any Virgil, Wyatt, or Morgan could have himself immortalized in a heroic pose, holding his trusty flamethrower. Have you ever seen that famous photo of the great Indian chief Geronimo? Well then, you're familiar with the work of Camillus Fly. While his wife Molly stayed at home in Tombstone, taking portraits of folks like Wyatt Earp and his brothers, Camillus roamed the land taking pictures of the Wild West. It wasn't easy work, because back then a camera alone weighed nearly 40 pounds, and the average roaming photographer carried 3 cameras, plus a portable darkroom to develop his glass plates. If you were to look through that window and see an Old West photographer shooting his camera at someone and taking their picture, you wouldn't see that customer smiling. You know why? Well, it's because photography in the old days was slow. The glass plates took several minutes to expose, and a customer who sat or stood for a portrait was often supported by a stand of wood or metal. This kept the customer still, but it was uncomfortable. The earliest photo that's still around was taken in 1827 by a Frenchman, but folks know his partner better, Louis Daguerre. In 1839, Daguerre invented silver-coated metallic plates for taking pictures and developed them with mercury vapor. This was a great improvement over the heavier glass plates, but it was dangerous because mercury vapor is poisonous. Then, in the 1880s, an American feller named George Eastman invented a small, lightweight camera with film that came on a roll. And pretty soon, photography became available to everyone. You know, Wyatt Earp enjoyed having his picture taken, and several famous photos of Wyatt Earp survive. In fact, he celebrated his 80th birthday by sitting for a formal portrait. Photography was well established by the time the Earps rolled into Arizona in 1879. In fact, here we've recreated the studio. One of the most important elements in photography in the Old West, and even today, is the darkroom. That's why an adobe building like this made an ideal darkroom. Photographers like Camillus Fly all used the same process to take pictures. Plates of glass would be coated with chemicals consisting of collodion and silver salts, exposed to light, and then washed in a silver nitrate bath. What remained on the glass was an image that the photographer wanted. I guess it wasn't a coincidence that Fly settled in Tombstone, a silver mining town. You could always find the blacksmiths in any of the Old West towns by the wagon wheels, leaning against the wall out front. Wagons hardly ever carried spares, so when your wheel broke, that was it, until the blacksmith fixed it. Every blacksmith had a wheelbarrow close at hand for moving around the raw materials of his trade, things like wood and charcoal for the forge and iron for making tools. The wheelbarrow also came in handy for cleaning up. Incidentally, he was called a blacksmith because the metal he worked with was iron, which was dark in color, as opposed to silver and gold. Heck, even folks who don't know nothing about the Old West know what this is. That's right, it's a hitching post. It's kind of like parking for horses. You ride on up, tie your horse to this hitching post, and go on about your business. A good blacksmith always lets a customer know what it's going to cost him right up front. You see, to get your horse shod all the way around, that's 4 shoes, could cost you up to $2. Even though wagon wheels were made out of wood, they had to have a steel rim all the way around so as the wood wouldn't wear down and break the wagon when they hit a rock. It had to be a tight fit, so the blacksmith would heat the rim until it expanded, slip it over the wheel, and drop it in cold water until it shrank snugly around the wooden rim. This one here is all fixed and ready to go back on the stagecoach. Wyatt Earp was a regular customer at the blacksmiths in Tombstone. He would take his prisoners over to the blacksmith to have them shackled or to have their irons, as handcuffs were called, removed. It cost $1.50 to put a man in irons, 75 cents to cut them off, and only the blacksmith had the tools to do the job. In a rough town like Tombstone, the smithy might make a decent living just taking care of the outlaws and chains. The bellows at the blacksmith shop worked just like the lungs, by taking in air and then blowing it onto the coals to keep them hot. But working next to a forge was no picnic. That's why pumping the bellows was usually the job of the blacksmith's apprentice. These blacksmiths in training most always did all the dirty work on the way to becoming full-fledged blacksmiths. Your blacksmith would begin work by heating a piece of iron in this special fireplace, or hearth, using a charcoal fire. Now, that was the fuel of choice because it burned at a higher temperature than plain wood, and it didn't give off smoke. If things had gone different in Wyatt's life, you might have been able to look into this window and find him inside reading law books. You see, Wyatt's grandfather was a lawyer, and everyone in the Earp family expected him to become a legal eagle as well. When Wyatt's family headed out west, it was expected that Wyatt would continue his lawyering studies in California. But once Wyatt got a taste of adventuring, he set his mind against any vocation that would have held him back from the kind of life he had enjoyed on that covered wagon journey. If you were to look in the window here, you'd have found a frontier lawyer, hard at work. Of course, lawyering wasn't all they did. Many of the legal eagles in the 1880s also published a small newspaper, in which, of course, they got free advertising. Becoming a lawyer wasn't all that difficult. In the 1800s, there weren't that many law schools in America. Why, most of the time, all a man had to do to be a lawyer was to be able to read. Of course, being an actor didn't hurt either. If you could make a jury cry, you were considered a great lawyer. More often than not, you'd have found a bunch of prospectors sitting on this bench out in front of the lawyer's office, waiting their turn. You see, even though lawyers spent a lot of time in the courtroom, much of their business in towns like this came from miners who needed someone to verify their claims. In the Old West, determining the ownership of mineral-bearing land was a serious business. The hitching post is real important. It's kind of like a parking place for horses. Of course, you only left your horse tied to a hitching post if you were staying for a short spell. If you were planning on spending the night, you'd leave your horse at the livery stable. Shh! You all be quiet now. We don't want to interrupt the Saddlemaker's work. To the local cowboys and cowgirls, this here would be one of the most appreciated folk in town. During roundup time, the cowpoke would sit on his mount for long hours every day. So, Having a well-made saddle would make the difference between comfort and agony for the rider and for the horse. As a result, you better believe that a bull nurse would want a saddle made to fit just right. That leather seat might cost $30, about a month's wages. But good saddle was a good investment. It might last for 30 years, perhaps longer than the cowpoke himself. Some of these pieces of leather hanging around here are parts of harness the saddlemakers has already sewed up, so that if the stagecoach comes in with a broken strap or something, it'll just take a few minutes to replace. Others are pieces waiting to be made into whatever the next person needs. It might be a belt to hold Doc Holliday's pants or a holster for Wyatt's 6-gun. Wyatt Earp met Bat Masterson when the two of them were hunting buffalo in Kansas. It was there that they learned how to handle a variety of guns, rifles and shotguns, and to discern between a good gun and a bad gun. You see, back in the Old West, guns weren't always very accurate. A man might go through 10 or more talking irons before he found one to his liking. So, trading posts would always have a ready supply of used, and maybe not so good, weapons to choose from. Horse collars are part of any set of harness that's made for hauling a heavy load, like mine equipment, plows, canned goods for the general store, saddle trees for this here shop. Wyatt worked as a freighter before he came out west, so he probably knew all about harnesses. In the Old West, folks usually lived where they worked. Here you can see the saddlemaker's cot up against the wall. Looks downright cozy if you ask me. Looks like this one has ropes strung across it to lie on, but it could just as easily be strips of leather called rawhide. What with the harness maker living where he works, chances are he kept his Sunday go-to-meeting clothes and valuables in this trunk. The saddlemaker used his fireplace for all kinds of things, to keep the place warm in winter, to cook his food if he didn't go out for meals, and, he probably always had a pot of coffee going. You can see he's working on somebody's bridle here. Maybe he's fixing a broken headstall for Wyatt. What's a headstall? Well, that's the leather part that fits on the horse's head and it holds a metal bar in the horse's mouth, called a bit. Being a saddlemaker in the Old West was a highly skilled occupation. A good saddle takes a while to make. First, you start with a good tree, which is the wooden base it's built on. This is the most important part for the rider and the horse. In big cities like San Francisco, saddlemakers carve their own trees. But in smaller places like Tombstone, where there weren't much timber, he usually ordered the tree from someplace in Texas or California. Next, he'd cut the leather, most often whole steer hides, into parts of the saddle. A good saddle took a while to make and involved the saddlemaker sitting for long hours at this here bench, carefully working the leather. There's all kinds of interesting stuff in here. Some of it's kind of hard to identify on account of most of it's pieces of something else. Besides saddles, harness, bridles, reins, chaps, and holsters, some saddle makers outfitted prospectors. They made big leather baskets that hung on either side of the donkey's back called panniers. He also made short whips called quirts out of braided leather. So, now you understand why you needed lots of different shapes and sizes of leather. The most important piece of equipment in a saddlemaker's life was probably his sewing machine. It works with a foot pedal, so a pair of strong legs come in real handy. Being that this here was the Old West and cowboys were everywhere, you could argue that the leather sewing machine was one of the most important pieces of equipment in the whole town. The only alternative was to punch holes in the leather with a tool called an awl and lace them together. It worked, but the laces wore out pretty quick and made an uncomfortable bump in the saddle, especially if you had to sit on it all day. For a new silver dollar, give me the right answer to this question.